It's been 1 year since the Central Bank of Nigeria intervened in the first of the 9 banks rescued in a bailout that cost the Central Bank of Nigeria $4 billion. And there are divided opinions over the ability of the newly formed AMCON to absorb stock market debts. We review AMCON's challenges and what's most critical going forward. Joining me now from Abuja is Central Bank of Nigeria Governor Sanusi Lamido Sanusi. Thank you very much, Governor, for your time this afternoon. Governor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much.
Can you hear me, Alicia?
Thank you very much for your time today. Well, let's take a look at this now. It's been a year since the banks have been rescued, 9 banks that were recapitalized. With the benefit of hindsight, tell us about some of the most critical moments so far.
Well, I think obviously the most critical moment was August the 14th when we received the reports having decided that there was need for action. We had to ponder the possible consequences of moving against management. If you look back a little over a year ago, these were people who were untouchable. They were extremely powerful. The banks themselves were about 30–40% of total assets. And there was a real risk that our action might precipitate a much more serious calamity. But it was very obvious to us at that point that things had to be done. I think that was the most difficult moment, but the week or two after that showed that the system was able to cope with it. And when we did the second round of interventions, for example, there was hardly a reaction in the market. And I think that was important. The second most difficult moment was the decision to publish the actual numbers after the audits were completed, especially in September. And most people felt that publishing the numbers and disclosing the full extent of the rot might cause a negative backlash. But we felt very strongly that if we're trying to improve transparency, to improve disclosures, and to improve market behavior, we had to go for full disclosure. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, all those decisions have turned out to be right.
Well, the massive focus, of course, has been on recapitalizing the banks and also getting money flowing through to the real economy. And now that's basically behind us, and we've started to see headway when it comes to this. We've also had a big focus on which investors are going to come up and buy rescued banks, if at all. Could you give us an update on this?
Well, as I speak to you, we have the advisors have finished analyzing bids already received for 4 of the banks. We expect the bids for the others to have been completed in terms of analysis by the end of this month. We are going to have presentations to the boards of those banks. They will look at those bids. They will decide if those bids are acceptable, and if they're acceptable, which ones are the preferred bidders and the reserve bidders. And subject to our no objection from Central Bank and Ministry of Finance and SEC, they will proceed with negotiations. So the process is ongoing. We're very satisfied with the way it has gone so far. And we do think that in most of the cases, we will get reasonable deals in place.
Well, Governor,
now, it doesn't mean, of course, that we have to accept. Yes.
Now, Governor, how many suitors have come along thus far, given the fact that we know that there's a fair mix between locals and, of course, foreigners? Well,
we do have, in the case of the 4 banks we've spoken about, we have, in the case of one, a local bank and a foreign bank. In the case of a second, we have a local bank, a foreign bank, and 2 private equity firms. In the case of a third, we have a local bank and a private equity firm. And in the case of the fourth, we have 1 strong local bank and a very weak bid from a PE firm. So at the moment, out of the 4, there are 2 foreign institutions involved and several local institutions and private equity firms that are partnering with foreign banks.
Governor, let's focus on AMCON, of course. This has been very a big focus for investors out there in terms of restoring confidence as well. But we know that there is apparently a big funding gap because we're looking at negative equity of between 1.4 and 1.5 trillion naira. We know that 24 banks have committed to 0.3% of their balance sheets to AMCON for the next 10 years. Some say that the funding gap is then going to be resolved by obviously the central bank and the Nigerian deposit insurance companies and of course other companies as well and other parties. Could you clarify for us, please?
Well, first of all, the funding gap is not as wide as people think, and I think people are not looking at the numbers. AMCON is going to purchase non-performing loans, and it's also going to take the collateral underlying those loans. If there's a need for recapitalization, it will put in money, but it will also take ordinary shares. Now, on a worst-case scenario, assuming we recover only 50% of secured loans and 25% of unsecured, and only 25% of equity investment, we expect the funding gap to be 800 billion. At the moment, in the sinking fund, we expect at least 1.5 trillion. There'll be 500 billion from the central bank and about 1 trillion from the banks. So there's actually a surplus in terms of funding. There is absolutely no funding gap. In fact, we do believe at the end of the 10 years of AMCON, we'll be returning money to the banks.
All right, well, just looking at what the stock markets have been doing recently, I mean, 3% down is what we saw for last week. You know, we've also seen a lot of delays when it came to the passing of the AMCON bill. A lot of people are concerned about when AMCON is going to actually come into play. Some are saying early next year. What is your view on this? When do you expect this to happen? Because obviously there's a lot of question marks surrounding the possible CEOs and also political considerations.
Well, there are actually no political considerations, and I think a lot of this speculation is because people don't ask. We do have a process that's ongoing. I believe by this week the president will be, I have agreed with the finance minister on recommendations for the board of AMCON. Those recommendations have gone to the president for consultation. If the president approves those recommendations, he sends the list to the Senate and they get confirmed. Once we have a board, we can do transactions. AMCON is not going to take off after you've put in the offices and the computers and the accounting systems. A lot of technical work has been happening in the last 3-4 months. We have an idea of what the MPLs are. We have an idea of what the collateral is. We have an idea of what the funding gap is. The banks are continuing with their discussions. Once there's a transaction on the table and the finance minister and the governor of the central bank approve the terms of the transaction, the board of AMCON will be in a position to approve. I don't see any reason why AMCON cannot take the decisions, the major decisions, in the next few weeks. Now, as far as the details are concerned, it will take a year or so, as you know, to go and audit every asset, to do every valuation, to do legal due diligence, to set up systems and processes, but those are not in any way going to interfere with the transaction and the purchase of assets. That's just housekeeping that will take place over a longer period.
There's also a lot of concern when it comes to AMCON that, yes, AMCON is going to buy up, the toxic debt and, of course, some of the bad loans that these banks have been involved in. But at the end of the day, if these loans are not recovered, the onus will still be on the bank to recover those loans. How do you see that playing out? I mean, do you think that that could be a growing concern going forward?
No, I don't think that the onus will be on the banks. I mean, once AMCON purchases the loans, AMCON takes responsibility for the recovery. Now, clearly, AMCON will outsource to loan recovery agents and handle restructuring and try to recover as much as possible. Otherwise, dispose of the assets that have been taken as collateral, because we're not going to purchase loans that have no collateral at all. There is absolutely no concern on that end. I do think for most of the loans and most of the collateral, it's a liquidity problem. It's very difficult in these times to dispose of assets, real estate or capital market assets. And if AMCON has a 10-year life, we simply hold on to those assets until the markets improve. That's how asset management companies work. I don't think that is any concern. In fact, I do think that we will have one of the most successful asset management corporations in terms of minimal loss to the taxpayer.
Governor, of course, you have been hailed as one of the governors in the world that has been very active in terms of changing what has been happening on the ground, not only from a banking perspective, but also from an economic perspective. You've been relatively active. Just looking at your mandate going forward and also in terms of inflation targeting, could you give us your strategies going forward? Because it's obviously a very difficult balancing act.
Well, I've always believed that stability is important. I think the core mandates of the central bank of monetary stability, external stability, and financial system stability will have to remain key. I don't think inflation targeting in itself is something we're ready for, partly because I think what we need is a stable environment that is conducive to growth, and sometimes inflation targeting can retard growth. when you have a country of 150 million people with 70% living below poverty line, it is extremely important, in my view, that we provide a stable environment, but ensure that the growth of the economy is not hampered by some desire to pursue a very low single-digit rate of inflation. We've brought inflation down in the last 1 year from 16% to 10%. We think we can do single-digit, and that's good enough. 9%, 9.5 will do for me. But I think keeping that stable environment so that there's an anchor while the economy continues to grow in real terms is a critical objective and balancing act as far as central banking is concerned. So the developmental role, the growth of the real sector, the creation of jobs and income will have to remain a major focus area in addition to financial stability for us as central bank.
Governor, just very quickly, I'd just like to go back to the purchasing of some of these rescued banks. Just looking at the monopoly status at this point in time, we obviously have various banks in Nigeria that are bigger than others. Are you concerned about monopolies being created, say, for instance, a bigger bank buying out a few of the smaller rescued banks? Are you concerned about a monopoly playing out in Nigeria?
Yes, I suppose from the very beginning I had said that as a regulator, the concept of too big to fail is something one cannot ignore. And when there is a bid and we look at what the institution is going to be in the event of a successful bid, we've got to think of the implications of that for systemic stability. But at the moment, what is important is to get the bids in, to get the interest in. I have not seen anything that suggests that we're going to have any kind of excessive concentrations as a result of this consolidation. What we have are mainly medium-sized banks trying to go into a game-changing mode. There are one or two very big banks, but I don't think they're looking for the largest of the institutions. So, and remember, the market has itself changed. I think in the last 1 year, there has been some redistribution of resources. While there have emerged obviously the big four, but the others are not so far behind. So I do think from what I have seen, the concern there is something that we can handle.
Governor Sanusi, thank you very much for your time today. Much appreciated for those insights. That was Lamido Sanusi, the Central Bank Governor of Nigeria.